You don't need me to tell you how crazy the world of politics is right now. And if you can stand the word Brexit one more time, then you can check out the video that I did recently on Brexit anxiety. But this week, that video kind of led me into thinking about this. This week, we're going to be taking a look at the psychology of politics, or psychology inside politics. We're going to be taking a look at the psychology of political figures, voting behaviour, and also the kind of electorate, the single voting behaviour, and how psychology can help us understand a little bit more, very briefly, about the world of politics. So make sure to stay tuned. Given the passion that people feel about politics, political parties, and political figures, and even voting behaviour, it seems to make sense that psychology definitely has a place in politics, and psychology can help us understand a little bit more about politics. However, research is pretty lacking in psychology and politics. Now, there are elements of psychological politics that can be actually taught at university. There's some modules even in some universities about political psychology. But for us, research is pretty lacking. However, that's not stopped psychological speculation about political figures. Things like narcissist or even psychopath or low self-esteem are terms that are readily used by the population, by the public, and by the media to understand political figures, even with lacking research. Donald Trump, for one, is a classic case of this. Now, I'm not going to go into political ideologies or voicing certain things about different political figures, but what I am going to say is that there's been plenty of media and public speculation about this man's psychological makeup. We don't necessarily know about his psychological diagnosis, and if we're being good psychologists, if we're trying to be good psychologists, then we're not just going to immediately speculate. But what can be apparent is that political figures such as Donald Trump can exhibit narcissistic qualities, even worse, maybe even psychopathic or sociopathic qualities. Again, we're not necessarily going into that diagnosis, but he is definitely a divisive and controversial figure in politics, and as a result has warranted a lot of psychological speculation. Now, one of the books that I haven't read yet, but I have heard about, and I'm going to read it soon, I'm going to pop a link down in the description about it, is The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. Now, this is a book that apparently is written by a number of different psychologists who give psychological interpretations of Donald Trump and other political figures. I think it sounds like a fascinating book, and when I've got time, I'm definitely going to buy it and read it over the next couple of months. I'd be really interested to know what you guys think of it. I think it's one of the only texts that I've heard of that goes into real depth, or apparently goes into real depth, again, I haven't read it, but goes into real depth about the psychological makeup of some of these political figures. It uses Donald Trump's name. It's not just about him, apparently it's about other political figures. But we can start to see that, there's a lot of psychological speculation about these political people and their psychological makeup. Again, with lacking research, but plenty of public and media speculation. So let's take a little bit of a look at politicians. Now, some of the questions when we're thinking of psychology and politicians are they narcissists? Are they psychopaths? Do they have low self-esteem? And it can be really difficult to answer some of those questions. When we actually think about what a narcissist is, narcissists can have a real sense of self, and that doesn't mean a strong sense of self, but they can be extremely egocentric. One of the things that can be the case for narcissists is that they can have extremely low self-esteem. They can actually have a very low sense of self-worth. They can experience a great deal of shame, and as a result, have coping mechanisms to help deal with that. So they might seek attention, they might seek approval, or become very, very reserved and vulnerable when experiencing criticism. And I think when I'm starting to label some of these characteristics, you're probably going to be able to think of some famous political figures as I'm talking about this. Once again, I'm not in the business of just speculating that somebody has got this diagnosis or not, but I think we can start to understand that, some of these politicians definitely do exhibit some of these characteristics. Like I said, there's been limited research, but there has been some research. Hill in 1998 conducted a study utilising the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, or the NIV, and that's basically a psychometric to measure narcissistic levels in individuals. This study looked at 4 professions. It looked at politicians, it looked at members of the clergy, it looked at teachers, and it looked at librarians. And what it tried to do was establish who had more narcissistic qualities. As I'm sure that you can understand and believe after doing this video, politicians came up as the highest level of narcissism. So there have been some studies that have suggested that politicians have high narcissistic qualities. Now, if we're being good in our psychology, or we're being good psychologists, we have to be critical thinkers. Obviously, the world is made up of more than 4 professions. There's not just librarians, teachers, members of the clergy, and politicians. There's other people as well. Likewise, The other three professions don't necessarily sound like the kind of people that would have narcissists or psychopaths in them, although this inventory was only measuring narcissists. Again, that's quite speculative of me to say, but I think we need to be a little bit careful about how we look at this study. One of the things that we can say is that out of those four professions, politicians seem to be the most narcissistic. There's probably plenty more to talk about regarding the psychology of politicians themselves, and I want to be really, really careful about how we go into that, because I think it's a super interesting topic, and I think we can just think of some situations and some individuals and say, yeah, definitely, those people are definitely psychopaths, or those people are definitely narcissists. They're power hungry, or they're self-centered, they only care about themselves. It's a very easy thing to do. Again, if we're being good in our psychology work, we need to be critical of that. We're not just jumping to conclusions. So I think it's appropriate that we kind of leave that there when we're thinking about politicians and psychology. Let's take a look at voting behaviour and psychology. Now, there's plenty that psychology can say about voting behaviour of the individual. And one of the first things that comes to mind for me is that actually, and some of the research states, is that actually voting behaviour can be a bit of a conflict with psychological principles. If you think of it from a rationalist standpoint, voting doesn't seem to make much sense for psychology. You know, the individual, it takes a lot of time, takes some effort, it might even take money in order for you to be able to vote. And one single vote is not going to sway the process of an election. So psychology might come from this from a different standpoint and say, well, hold on, single electorate voting doesn't seem to make much sense. Psychology, though, doesn't stop there, of course. It goes further. It doesn't just jump to assumptions. And the next question is, why then do people vote? Well, sometimes things like people believing that they're contributing to a greater good. People perhaps believing that they're contributing to a democratic process or keeping a stable structure in society. Some people do it out of guilt even. Some people do it out of a genetic basis. Some people do it just because it's expected of them. There are a number of different reasons as to why the individual votes. The genetics of voting behaviour has been something that actually has been looked at quite a bit in research. And there's been a lot of speculation that, you know, if an individual votes, then their families are going to vote, their children, their grandchildren are likely going to vote. But Baker in 2002 looked at this and thought, I wonder if there is a genetic makeup of voting behaviour. And he looked at adopted children who had been introduced to new families and looked at their voting behaviour. It was found that adopted children often would vote if the family that they were adopted into also voted more often than not. So this speaks to the fact that, you know, it's not as simple as just saying there's a genetic makeup to voting behaviour. There's definitely something here about environmental exposure. You know, what you're exposed to, what voting behaviour are you exposed to. If you are in a family that doesn't vote, you're probably more likely to not vote. If you're in a family that does vote, then you're likely to vote. Very briefly, I'm going to take a look at voting and group behaviour. Now, this is important for, you know, institutions like political parties. They want to understand a little bit more about group behaviour and group dynamics in order for them to build their base, their political base and their electorate base. Psychology is not only interested in politicians, it's not only interested in the individual who votes, it's also interested in the wider picture, the bigger group. Political parties utilise this as well. Now, about 2 years ago, I did a video on the psychology of conformity. It was a big video that I did back then. It was a number of years ago, so it's going to look a lot different than it does now. But I do go into some of the concepts of conformity. And some of those things are applicable when we're thinking about group behaviour and politics when we're thinking on a psychological level. What can happen sometimes is political parties can utilise and move groups to a conformity basis to ensure that they have loyalty, to ensure that their members of their political party stay central to their vision, to ensure that people who voted for them last year vote for them this year as well. They use conformity because what can happen, it's human nature, is that when an individual maybe starts to deviate from a message or starts to think a little bit differently, they're more likely to stay conformed to the group because the group is larger, because there's more people than just that one individual. So what can happen sometimes is political parties can bark on about their message time and time again. They can even use propaganda to remind people of their message, to maintain that level of conformity. Okay guys, thanks so much for watching this brief video on the psychology of politics. I felt like this was a topic that we could talk about for hours, but I hope this has given you a couple of minutes of consideration about how psychology has an impact on politics.